One of the central dynamics sending the wake spinning surfward is that of gender. To what extent is it a central determinant of our culture, and to what extent can its critical investigation lead to its undermining? In Finnegans Wake, from the first page, we are hinted at the possibility of a unique capacity for revolution that the female has for Joyce, considering that it begins not in Adam and Eve's, but Eve and Adam's. There's a privileging of the feminine which we can see breaking through Finnegans Wake. Whereas Ulysses was primarily concerned with two male figures and a sort of secondary female character, in Finnegans Wake, it can be argued that the female principle receives a new light, a new sense of attention, and the various dynamics that undergird and fracture femininity in our contemporary culture is of much concern for Joyce. He's going to focus on the way that women are subjugated through ideologies like religion or the state. He's going to look at the patriarchal dynamics that, for example, condemn women to submission in the household, to sexual submission, to economic submission. Therefore, he's also going to talk about the history of the female slave trade. Also, one of the chief undercurrents, perhaps overcurrents of the Wake, is violence against women. How does this play out in Finnegans Wake? This is always an open and unsure question for me. But one of the most interesting ways in which women fight back in Finnegans Wake is an early episode we get in Chapter 1 about the Prankquean. And the Prankquean and Jarl von Huther are having this back and forth. And the Prankquean keeps giving a riddle. And the first instantiation we get of it is, why do I am a look-alike a pass of porter piece? Now you might be looking at this and wondering, what the heck does this mean? That is indeed the great question. This very breakdown of meaning that we get as readers when we confront a passage like this is central to Joyce's praxis and theory in his latter novels. And in Finnegans Wake, I think Joyce is trying to advocate for an understanding of écriture féminine, of feminine writing, the likes of which would be theorized by many feminists after him, in a way where writing is always on the edge of sense. And this sort of status quo paternalistic view of language as a series of rule-bound definitions, the likes of which we would get in a prescriptive dictionary. That is the sort of masculine principle which seeks to obstinately subdue through power. And yet there's a unique power of the feminine which seems to be driving Finnegans Wake on a sort of technological, dromological level. And we see it in the dynamics of the way that this first instantiation of this riddle burgeons into a wide motivic complex. Joyce is very well known for his motifs in Finnegans Wake, and he's taking a lot of this from Wagner. Wagner, of course, really brings to life in orchestral music the usage of the motif to signal a character entering the stage, or an idea, or a prop piece. All of these can be used. For example, we have the sword motif, we have the rainbow motif, we have Wotan's spear. All of these are common motifs. We also have Siegfried's horn call. We have Fafner's very foreboding music. All of these motifs, even in Wagner, we see them sort of being torn apart at the seams, being ramified through different rhythmic and timbral and environmental contexts in a way that really kind of tests the limits of our ability to see these units as part of a contiguous history and group of motifs. And in Finnegans Wake, Joyce wants to investigate this on a literary and linguistic level. He wants to look at what are the conventions, but also what are the limitations and fetters that allow us to piece together different linguistic units as being related in some way. So he's concerned with the conditions of readerly perception, the ways by which we internalize and interpolate language that we've never seen before and turn them into meaningful units. Now I have here a list of all the different instances we get of the Prankquean's riddle. And you're going to see that by the time we get to the end of this list, the question really is this still the same riddle? This is really a ship of Theseus kind of situation, right? To what extent, through a number of ramified changes, can the entity that sort of underlies or, transcends the parts, can it be said to persist? So this question of the persistence of meaning, of form, of meter, of timbre, of cadence, all of these are interrelated here. And as we go through the themes, I want us to note the relationships that allow us to see these as part of a motivic complex. And you're going to see that these usually happen in rapid succession because I've got the page and line numbers off to the side. So immediately after this first invocation, we get, why do I look like 2 pots of porter piece? Then shortly thereafter, why do I look like 3 pots of porter piece? Now, interesting to note is not only is A, 2, and 3 being changed, so we're counting these 3 different versions, but also porter piece has been changed. In the last one, there's a space. We might ask, small of a difference as this may be, to what extent does it contribute to the development of this theme? Because we can see that there is not merely one change happening at a time, but oftentimes many. Harkening across history 200 pages later, how do you do that lack-a-lock and pass the poker, please? And how else do we hook our hike to find that pint of porter, please? A glass of peel and pip for Mr. Potter of Texas, please. Here we can see that this one is a lot more fragmentary. The only thing that's keeping it similar is this lilting rhythm, and the Potter being similar to porter, and this please being similar to the piece, please, or place that we've gotten before. Where can a catch or hook alive a suit and souterkins? No, how did he curse or hoot alike the suit and solder skins? And ere he could catch a hook or line to suit their saucy skins. With guerrilla men a spear, a spore, to prank the pranks of prim kisses. This one's a lot more abstract too. We have the pranks here, signaling the prank queen. And a few pages later, why do we aim alike a pose of puerter piece? Where would his a look alike, or boss of both a piece? For why do you lack a link of luck to poise a pont of perfect peace? Here we've sort of elongated this last phrase and added to poise a pont of perfect peace. We've added another word, another syllable here, and yet we see the contiguity. O Mr. Prince of Pouring Tor, whatever shall I peace to do? Here again, just by the content of this pouring together, pouring to her, pouring over, of the piece, of the place, the please, the peas. What'll you take to link to light a pike on Porpoise Place? So I think this is a very insightful instance of motifs developing, meanings accreting. And it would be hard to find any one overlapping meaning that ramifies through the context of all of these and maintains some sort of essence. Therefore, Joyce seems here to be enumerating a theory of, as Deleuze would call it, difference and repetition. Looking at the way that poetry and hermeneutics and speech and language work such that through a series of changes, we can sense degrees of hearkening. And through these degrees of hearkening, we can find various tenuous relationships, which again can span rhythm, structure, pace, timbre, tone, pitch. The spelling changes, oftentimes the poetic meter changes. So if you're coming from poetry and metrical analysis, you might fly over some of these. And you can see that maybe you, as the watcher, find one of these in doubt. You do not think that it is part of this motivic complex. Ultimately, there is no objective criteria for motifs here. And yet this is radically important because it allows for one voice, the Prankquean, to ramify across the entire book. And in so doing, there is a power given to the female voice and the ability to thrive on the edge of sense, not as if this was some pathological stain upon females. In fact, it might speak more to the history of socioeconomic marginalization of women, whereby they're not given the proper education to express themselves. And yet, when reading Joyce, we might say that even this seems a little bit patronizing to the Prankquean, for she seems to have a sort of jeering grin that she brings with her as she juts in every once in a while, which is, of course, also the grin of Joyce, the comic, who comes in, farcical as he may be, and tells us something important about the mundane. In fact, beyond the mundane, the unearthly, the unheimlich, the unhomely, or the uncanny, as Freud would put it. And I think this is really important because we can see the Prankquean here as really something of a feminist badass. Because what does she do with Jarl von Huther? Well, she continues to usurp his supposed masculine authority through the invocation of something, the meaning of which he cannot place, and yet which clearly plagues the entirety of Finnegans Wake. To place such an important motif in the mouth of a woman is critically important if we consider that perhaps the most famous section of Finnegans Wake is the Anna Livia Pluribel section, of which we have the tell me all, tell me now motif, which gets repeated and which is a fundamentally female-associated motif. So there's an interesting back and forth here with the feminine voice, which I don't think we can put into one category, precisely because Joyce is denying this notion of the feminine voice. For when we look at all these different instantiations of the Prankquean's motif, of her riddle, there is no one constitutive voice which springs through. No one singular motivation that motivates the appearance of any of these in the places they appear. In fact, what is so frustrating about Finnegans Wake is that many times Joyce so clearly flaunts our conventions of sense that oftentimes it's not necessary or even recommended that we approach Finnegans Wake from the perspective of assuming the author always has a sensible intent in mind, which is to say, trying to deliver some sort of discrete sense, right? A package of sensoria that are given to us. Instead, Joyce is doing something that he's done across his oeuvre, but another example would be Stephen Dedalus in the second chapter of Ulysses, who tells a riddle about a fox burying its grandmother to the schoolboys that he's teaching. And it's really an impossible riddle, not something that could be solved based on the information given, which sort of defeats the conventions of a riddle. And yet it gets the kids thinking. It gets them questioning and pondering, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is all Joyce wants his readers to do, and perhaps it's something that he's trying to show women can and should do. That they should fight back and wrest the powers of language from those who would restrict it to sense, to simply a question of clarity or representation or authenticity, and beyond this, speak to the power of the voice's historical hearkening. In fact, in many ways, we might see this as a sort of female diaspora that populates the pages of Finnegans Wake and which creates a history of its own. A subaltern history which cannot speak through the language of sense, and yet nevertheless surfs the wake anew. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope it's been somewhat interesting in thinking about all these ideas. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which I do the second Sunday of every month. You can tailor it to your needs. Maybe you need help with some reading or talking about some philosophical issue. I'm here to help. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me buy all the books that I need to provide y'all with content, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.